Welcome to the extremely boring stories. Today we listening, the quiet life of medieval executioners. You are standing at the edge of a medieval town just before dawn. The air is quiet, not because nothing is happening, but because something inevitable is approaching. Somewhere beyond the low stone walls, a man is waking. His name is not important, and in many records it is never written down. He is simply referred to as the executioner. He eats, dresses, and walks like anyone else, but the town does not see him as a man in the ordinary sense. He exists in a narrow space between necessity and avoidance. In medieval Europe, justice was not abstract. It was not hidden behind paperwork or distant institutions. Justice was physical, visible, and slow. When a sentence was passed, someone had to carry it out. That responsibility fell upon the executioner, a figure both essential and quietly despised. You might expect his life to be dramatic, filled with violence and intensity, but most of his days were marked by waiting, maintenance, and isolation. Executioners were municipal employees. Town councils hired them, paid them, and depended on them, yet refused to treat them as equals. In legal documents, you can find their wages listed alongside expenses for rope, wood, and repairs to gallows. They were part of the town's infrastructure, as necessary as walls or gates, but never celebrated. You would notice first where he lived. Rarely inside the town proper, the executioner's house was usually placed near the gallows field or beyond the last line of homes. This physical distance mattered. It reflected a belief that moral contamination could spread through proximity. People feared that too much closeness to death, punishment, and blood might stain ordinary life. So the executioner lived apart, not by choice, but by expectation. When he walked into town, people stepped aside, not out of respect, but out of discomfort. Children were told not to speak to him. Shopkeepers served him quickly, sometimes leaving goods on the counter rather than placing them directly into his hands. The executioner noticed these things, even if no one acknowledged them aloud. Yet despite this social exile, his role was defined by precision. He was expected to be skilled. A clean execution was considered merciful and efficient. A failed execution brought shame, outrage, and sometimes violence from the crowd. This meant that long before any sentence was carried out, the executioner spent hours preparing. He sharpened blades, tested ropes, measured distances, and practiced movements. These preparations filled far more of his life than the executions themselves. You might imagine him as emotionally hardened, but historical records suggest something quieter. Executioners kept notebooks. Some wrote down the number of executions they performed, the method used, and the outcome. These records were not confessions. They were professional logs, similar to those kept by craftsmen. The tone is often neutral, even dull. There is no flourish, no reflection. Just dates, places, and results. Execution days were public events. The executioner was expected to arrive early, often before the crowd gathered. He inspected the scaffold, adjusted the structure, and waited. Waiting was a significant part of his work. Sometimes sentences were delayed. Sometimes pardons arrived at the last moment. Sometimes the condemned person collapsed before reaching the platform. The executioner stood ready regardless. During these long pauses, he remained visible. People stared at him while pretending not to. He became a focal point for unease. The crowd projected their fear and curiosity onto him, even though he was not the one who made the law or passed the sentence. He was simply the one who made the decision final. You may find it surprising that executioners were often deeply knowledgeable about anatomy. Repeated exposure to the human body gave them practical understanding that physicians sometimes lacked. This knowledge was unofficial and unrecognized. Universities did not welcome executioners. Guilds excluded them. Still, people came to them quietly for advice on broken bones, infections, and wounds. The same hands that carried out death were sometimes trusted to ease pain. This contradiction defined the executioner's existence. He was shunned publicly and sought privately, feared openly and depended upon quietly. His work required calmness, steady hands, and emotional restraint. Displays of cruelty were discouraged. An execution was not meant to be theatrical. It was meant to be conclusive. When the work was done, the executioner did not join celebrations or gatherings. He cleaned his tools, returned home, and waited again. There were weeks, sometimes months, between executions. During that time, he performed secondary duties. He removed animal carcasses, cleaned latrines, disposed of unclaimed bodies, and maintained gallows. These tasks reinforced his association with what society wished to forget. If you remain with the executioner after the crowd has dispersed, after the scaffold has been dismantled and the square swept clean, you begin to notice something that medieval records rarely state outright. The executioner is almost never alone in his fate. His profession does not end with him. It stretches quietly into the lives of his wife, his children, and sometimes his grandchildren. In many towns, execution was not simply a job. It was an inheritance. You might assume that anyone could apply to become an executioner, but in practice this was rare. The position carried a social stigma so strong that few people willingly accepted it. Town councils preferred candidates who already lived outside respectable society. This often meant that the son of an executioner became the next executioner, not because he desired it, but because no one else would. Children born into these families grew up understanding their limits early. They were allowed to exist in the town, but not to fully belong to it. Other children were warned against playing with them. Schools, where they existed at all, discouraged their attendance. Apprenticeships and trades were closed to them. Even religious life carried barriers. While executioners were Christian and attended church, they were often assigned separate seating, sometimes near the door, sometimes in a distinct corner. Marriage posed another quiet challenge. Most respectable families refused to allow their daughters to marry into an executioner's household. As a result, executioners often married within a small circle of similarly excluded families, gravediggers, knackers, prostitutes, or other executioners' children from nearby towns. Over generations, this created a narrow social world, closed in on itself, where identity was fixed before choice became possible. Daily life within the executioner's home was, on the surface, unremarkable. Meals were cooked, clothes were mended, children were taught basic skills. But the awareness of difference never fully faded. The tools of the profession were kept carefully, often locked away. Children learned not to touch them, not out of fear, but respect. These objects were both livelihood and burden. You may find it unexpected that many executioners' children received practical education in anatomy and medicine. Fathers passed on knowledge gained through years of exposure to injuries and death. This learning was quiet, informal, and deeply practical. In some regions, executioners became unofficial surgeons, especially for tasks considered shameful or unpleasant. They set broken bones, treated infections, and handled amputations that respectable doctors avoided. This medical role further complicated their position. Townspeople who would not greet an executioner in the street might seek his help under cover of night. Payment was discreet. Gratitude was rarely public. These interactions reinforced a strange truth: the executioner was both untouchable and indispensable. Religion played an important role in how executioners understood themselves. They prayed. They attended Mass. Many believed firmly that they were instruments of lawful authority rather than agents of personal violence. Some sought reassurance from priests, though not all priests were willing to provide it. Confession, when granted, focused not on the act itself, but on intent. Was the execution carried out correctly? Was it done without cruelty? These questions mattered deeply. As you observe the executioner's routine over months and years, the rhythm becomes predictable. Long periods of inactivity punctuated by moments of intense public focus. During quiet weeks, he repaired equipment, maintained property, and tended small plots of land. Some kept animals. Others brewed beer or collected fees for secondary services assigned by the town. This steady, repetitive labor formed the bulk of their existence. Emotionally, the work required restraint. Displays of remorse were seen as weakness. Displays of enthusiasm were dangerous. The ideal executioner was calm, silent, and precise. Over time, this emotional narrowing affected how they were perceived. Chroniclers described them as cold, even dull. In reality, this was a survival strategy. To feel too much was to invite collapse. When executions went wrong, the consequences were immediate and severe. A poorly tied knot, a dull blade, a misjudged swing, any of these could turn a lawful sentence into prolonged suffering. Crowds did not always blame the authorities. Often, they blamed the executioner. Stones were thrown. Insults shouted. In rare cases, executioners were beaten or killed by mobs. These incidents reinforced the importance of flawless preparation and reinforced fear as a constant companion. You begin to see that the executioner lived under pressure from multiple directions. The law demanded competence. The crowd demanded speed. Religion demanded moral clarity. Society demanded distance. Family demanded stability. Each demand pulled in a different direction, leaving little room for personal identity beyond the role itself. As years passed, aging brought new anxieties. Executioners relied on physical strength and steady hands. Tremors, poor eyesight, or injury threatened not only their income but their safety. Some attempted to train assistants, often sons or nephews. Others petitioned town councils for retirement, though pensions were rare and modest. To stop working did not mean acceptance into society. The stigma did not fade with age. What stands out most is how ordinary all of this was. There were no dramatic monologues, no public reckonings. The executioner's life unfolded quietly, shaped by routine, exclusion, and responsibility. He did not stand outside history. He moved through it steadily, performing a task that allowed others to believe justice was clean and distant. If you walk away from a medieval town at a slow, unhurried pace, you will eventually reach a point where the noise fades. The sound of carts on stone roads dulls. Voices become fewer. The smells of bread, smoke, and animals soften into open air. Before you reach open countryside, there is often a narrow, uneasy space, neither fully town nor fully wilderness. This is where the executioner lived. The city walls were not just defensive structures. They were symbols. Inside them was order, law, trade, and recognized community. Outside them was uncertainty, labor, and social ambiguity. To live beyond the walls was not always a punishment, but it was rarely a privilege. For the executioner, it was an expectation. You might imagine the executioner's home as grim or forbidding, but in reality it was usually practical and modest. A small house, sometimes with a fenced yard, often close to the gallows field or a crossroads. The location served a purpose. Executions took place outside the town center in many regions, partly for space, partly to keep death at a distance. The executioner's proximity to this space made his role easier, and the town's conscience quieter. Living outside the walls shaped daily life in subtle ways. Water had to be carried farther. Markets were less accessible. Protection during unrest was weaker. If bandits passed through, the executioner's house was vulnerable. The town guards were not stationed nearby, and neighbors were few. Isolation was not symbolic alone, it was practical. Yet this separation also created a rhythm of quiet. The executioner woke earlier than most, not because his work demanded it, but because daylight mattered when you lived at the margins. He maintained his own property carefully. Repairs were not optional. A broken fence or roof was not quickly noticed by town authorities. Self-reliance was essential. You would notice that few people visited. Official messengers came when duty called. Occasionally, a town clerk arrived with documents or payment. Sometimes, under cover of evening, a villager approached with a private request: removal of an animal carcass, treatment of a wound, or disposal of something best not discussed openly. These visits were brief and purposeful. The road near the executioner's home was used by many but acknowledged by few. Travelers passed without stopping. Locals avoided lingering. Children dared one another to run close and then flee. The executioner observed all of this from a distance. Over time, this distance became familiar. Loneliness did not always feel sharp, often it was simply constant. Living beyond the walls also meant being exposed to nature more directly. Weather mattered. Floods, cold winters, and poor harvests hit harder when help was far away. The executioner and his family learned practical survival skills. They stored food carefully, reused materials, and wasted little. These habits were not born of virtue but necessity. The boundary between town and executioner was maintained through routine. On days without duties, there was no reason to cross the gates. On days with executions, the crossing became symbolic. The executioner entered the town not as a resident, but as a function. He walked a familiar route, often early, often alone. People noticed him immediately. Conversations paused. space opened. Once inside, his movements were efficient. He did not linger. He did not browse. He did not socialize. He completed tasks and left. The gates closed behind him, restoring the town's sense of separation. This pattern repeated over years, reinforcing an unspoken agreement: he would remain close enough to serve, far enough to ignore. At night, the edge of town was quieter than inside, but not peaceful. Sounds traveled farther. The executioner heard distant bells, dogs, arguments, and sometimes celebrations. He heard them without participating. This partial connection, hearing without joining, defined his relationship to the community. Religion followed him beyond the walls, but imperfectly. Some churches were inside the town, requiring a crossing that reminded everyone of his presence. Others maintained small chapels or roadside shrines outside the gates. These spaces offered privacy but also reinforced separation. Worship was allowed. Belonging was not. You may wonder whether living outside the walls offered any advantage. In rare cases, yes. Land was cheaper. Space was greater. Certain restrictions were looser. The executioner could keep animals, conduct unpleasant work, and store tools without complaint. This limited freedom, however, came at the cost of constant visibility as an outsider. The landscape itself reinforced identity. Gallows were often placed on hills or open fields, visible from afar. Their presence was a warning and a reminder. The executioner lived near this symbol, not by accident, but design. Every traveler approaching the town passed both gallows and house, absorbing the message before reaching the gate. Over time, this environment shaped how executioners saw themselves. They did not expect inclusion. They measured success differently. Survival, stability, and avoiding public failure became priorities. Ambition narrowed. Dreams adjusted. Life became smaller, steadier, and quieter. And yet, even in this isolation, the executioner was never fully separate from the town. His livelihood depended on its laws. His safety depended on its tolerance. His identity existed because of its judgment. Living outside the walls was not freedom, it was a carefully maintained distance. When you lived outside the city walls long enough, you begin to understand that walls do more than keep enemies out. They organize life. Inside them, streets are maintained, disputes are settled quickly, and help is close at hand. Outside them, everything takes longer, costs more effort, and carries greater risk. For the executioner, this was not a temporary inconvenience. It was a permanent condition. Protection was the most obvious difference. City walls offered safety not only from invading armies, but from everyday danger. Fires were contained more quickly. Guards intervened in disputes. Laws were enforced within sight of authority. Beyond the walls, the executioner's household relied on itself. If a fight broke out, if thieves approached, or if travelers caused trouble, there was no immediate protection. Calling for help often meant waiting. This exposure shaped behavior. Doors were reinforced. Tools doubled as weapons. Animals were kept close at night. The executioner learned to listen carefully to unfamiliar sounds. These were not signs of fear, but of adjustment. Survival outside the walls depended on awareness rather than reassurance. Illness, too, carried greater weight. Inside the town, physicians and healers were nearby. Outside, distance delayed care. Ironically, the executioner's own knowledge of anatomy sometimes made him his family's only medical support. He set bones, cleaned wounds, and managed fevers with limited resources. Death, when it came, felt closer and more ordinary. Weather imposed itself more forcefully beyond the walls. Storms damaged roofs. Cold seeped into walls. Roads turned to mud, isolating households further. The executioner's family prepared carefully for winter, storing food and fuel in quantities that town dwellers often took for granted. Poor planning meant hunger. Despite this exposure, there was a strange predictability to life at the margins. The town's daily noise softened with distance. Bells were faint. Crowds were unseen. Time passed differently. Days were marked by chores rather than events. Seasons mattered more than announcements or laws. This quiet routine became a form of stability. Yet the executioner was never allowed to forget his connection to the town. Legal obligations reached beyond the walls. When summoned, he was expected to respond immediately. Failure to appear could result in fines or dismissal. His isolation did not excuse absence. It simply made compliance harder. Journeys into the town were deliberate. Clothing was chosen carefully. Tools were wrapped and carried discreetly. The executioner's arrival was always noticed. People recognized him by posture, route, and reputation. Even without uniform, his role preceded him. Once inside, he followed familiar paths. He avoided crowded streets when possible. He conducted business quickly. Payment was handled efficiently, sometimes through intermediaries to limit interaction. These routines reduced friction and embarrassment for everyone involved. The boundary between inside and outside was reinforced through custom rather than law. There were no official signs declaring where executioners must live. Instead, tradition guided placement. New executioners were often assigned existing houses beyond the walls. Over time, these locations became fixed in collective memory. Everyone knew where such people lived. Markets represented a particular challenge. Executioners needed supplies, yet market life was social. Bargaining, conversation, and casual exchange were expected. Many executioners shopped early or late to avoid crowds. Some relied on family members to make purchases. Others traded services quietly in exchange for goods. Children raised outside the walls absorbed these patterns naturally. They learned which paths to take, which spaces to avoid, and which interactions required caution. Their understanding of community was shaped by exclusion rather than inclusion. For them, the walls were not just stone, they were boundaries of possibility. Occasionally, boundaries shifted. Towns expanded. Walls were rebuilt farther out. When this happened, the executioner's house sometimes found itself newly enclosed. This change did not bring acceptance. New walls did not erase old attitudes. In some cases, a new house was built farther out, restoring the distance that custom demanded. Festivals highlighted exclusion most clearly. Sounds of music and celebration carried far beyond the walls. Firelight flickered against stone. The executioner and his family heard these signals of belonging without receiving invitations. They observed joy indirectly, as something that happened nearby but not with them. Still, Life beyond the walls was not without moments of dignity. There was pride in self-sufficiency. There was control over one's immediate space. There was a quiet understanding between families who shared the margins, gravediggers, tanners, and others whose work required distance. These relationships were functional, respectful, and free of pretense. The executioner's relationship with authority was also shaped by location. Town officials visited rarely, but when they did, their presence carried weight. Instructions were clear. Expectations were formal. Disputes were settled quickly, usually in favor of the town. Living outside the walls meant being seen as an extension of municipal function rather than a citizen with leverage. As years passed, the executioner aged within this landscape. Paths became familiar. Distances shortened through habit. The isolation became routine rather than painful. What once felt like exclusion became a known condition, manageable through repetition. You are not yet old enough to understand what your father does for a living, but you already feel the consequences of it. This is how life begins for the child of a medieval executioner, not with knowledge, but with distance. The distance appears first in small ways, other children stepping back, adults lowering their voices, doors closing a little too quickly. Long before the profession is explained, its weight is already present. In medieval society, identity was rarely flexible. A person's trade, family, and reputation formed a single, lasting whole. For executioners, this identity extended outward, attaching itself firmly to wives and children. The work of one person marked an entire household. Shame, once assigned, did not stop at the individual. You would find that executioners' families were recorded differently in documents. Names were sometimes omitted. Lineages were shortened or avoided entirely. Where a baker's son might be listed proudly in guild records, an executioner's son often appeared only when unavoidable. This silence was not accidental. It reflected a belief that the stain of execution could be inherited. Children grew up hearing whispers before they heard explanations. They learned which houses welcomed them and which did not. Invitations to play were rare. Apprenticeships were denied without discussion. Even when a child showed skill or intelligence, doors remained closed. The reason was not spoken aloud, but it was understood. Marriage was perhaps the clearest demonstration of inherited shame. Respectable families refused alliances with executioners' households. A daughter of an executioner was considered unsuitable, regardless of character. A son was considered dangerous, not physically, but socially. To marry into such a family was to accept permanent exclusion. As a result, executioners' families formed narrow social circles. They married among themselves or among other marginalized professions. These unions were practical rather than romantic. Stability mattered more than affection. Shared exclusion created understanding, if not warmth. Inside the household, life was structured around restraint. Parents taught children how to behave in public, when to speak, when to remain silent, when to withdraw. Pride was discouraged. Attention invited trouble. Survival depended on being unremarkable. Religious life offered limited comfort. While executioners' families attended church, they often sat apart. Some parishes assigned them specific benches. Others allowed attendance only at certain times. The message was subtle but consistent. faith was permitted, equality was not. Children asked questions eventually. They wanted to know why their family lived apart, why their father carried certain tools, why neighbors avoided them. Parents answered carefully. Some explained the profession as service to law and order. Others avoided explanation altogether, letting routine replace understanding. Education, where available, was informal. Fathers taught sons practical skills early. Daughters learned household management and quiet endurance. Literacy was inconsistent. Formal schooling required acceptance, and acceptance was rare. Despite this, executioners' families developed strong internal bonds. Dependence on one another fostered loyalty. Secrets were kept. Conflicts were resolved privately. Outsiders were rarely trusted. As children grew older, a difficult truth emerged. Leaving the family did not guarantee escape from the name. Towns shared information. Reputations traveled. A young man might move to another city, only to find his background already known. Reinvention was difficult in a world that valued lineage over choice. Some children accepted inheritance without resistance. Becoming an executioner promised stability, income, and a defined place, however limited. Others resisted quietly, seeking roles as assistants, laborers, or servants. Success was rare but not impossible. For daughters, options were fewer. Marriage within accepted circles offered security. Remaining unmarried meant lifelong dependence on family. Independence was constrained by reputation. You begin to understand that shame in medieval society was not an emotion, it was a structure. It shaped housing, work, marriage, and belief. For executioners' families, it was not earned through action. It was assigned at birth and reinforced daily. Living under the shadow of inherited shame was not an abstract experience. It manifested in daily routines, small gestures, and subtle avoidance. For the executioner's family, every meal, every journey to the market, every interaction with neighbors carried the potential for judgment. Life became a series of carefully measured actions, designed to minimize exposure and discomfort. Children learned quickly which doors could be opened and which should remain closed. They understood that a wrong word in the street, a loud laugh, or an inattentive glance could attract scrutiny. Games were played quietly, sometimes alone, sometimes with children whose families shared a similar status on the margins of society. Normal childhood freedoms were curtailed, replaced by caution. Inside the household, routines provided structure and predictability. Mothers and fathers taught skills essential to survival beyond social favor. Daughters learned to manage scarce resources, cook efficiently, and maintain clothing that had to last seasons rather than weeks. Sons learned tools of the trade, not only the physical implements of execution but also skills of observation, patience, and precision. Practical knowledge became a form of inheritance alongside social stigma. Education was complicated. Where literacy was offered, it was often limited to reading and basic calculation needed for managing accounts or documenting official work. History and philosophy were rare luxuries. In some towns, executioners' children were discouraged from formal study entirely, to prevent contact with guilds, universities, or clerical positions that might expose them to rejection. Learning was practical rather than aspirational. The household itself was an extension of the profession's boundaries. Tools were stored carefully, always visible yet controlled. Knives, ropes, and instruments of the trade were kept organized, maintained, and respected. Children were taught their use only when necessary, but always with the understanding that mishandling could have social consequences. Even small mistakes became lessons in restraint and diligence. Religious practice offered both comfort and limitation. Churches sometimes welcomed families at specific times or in separate seating, acknowledging spiritual needs without granting full social inclusion. Confession and prayer were deeply private acts, but they could provide subtle reassurance. Faith was intertwined with duty, offering moral justification for a life that society otherwise regarded with suspicion. The outside world provided constant reminders of the family's marginality. Neighbors greeted with hesitation, markets opened with distance, and children's peers tested boundaries before retreating. These daily interactions reinforce the dual reality: dependence on society for survival, and exclusion from its acceptance. Family members became keenly aware that survival required adaptation, not confrontation. Marriage remained a central concern. For daughters, the choice of partner was largely dictated by social feasibility rather than personal inclination. Marrying within the small circle of similarly stigmatized households offered security and understanding but limited prospects. Sons faced a paradox: taking up the family trade ensured continuity and stability but cemented marginalization, while seeking alternative roles invited scrutiny and potential failure. Decisions were rarely easy, rarely free. Within the home, family bonds grew stronger in response to external pressures. Shared experience created loyalty, discretion, and resilience. Stories were told with caution, humor was muted, and curiosity about the outside world was often tempered by lessons in careful observation. Trust was internal, survival external. Economic life added additional complexity. The executioner's income was official, sanctioned, and reliable in a way few marginal professions could match. Yet it was not abundant, and towns often delayed payment. Families learned to budget meticulously, stretch provisions, and store surplus for lean periods. Craft skills, farming, or secondary labor often supplemented income. Every action was calculated for efficiency, not extravagance. Psychologically, the inherited shame was pervasive yet subtle. Children internalized boundaries early. They understood that social exclusion was permanent, but they also learned the quiet power of competence. Mastery of daily tasks, careful handling of tools, and discretion in public life became sources of control. Within the household, identity could be reclaimed, if only in private. Even in the midst of repetition, however, tension persisted. Questions of justice, morality, and social perception loomed quietly. How much of life was determined by birth, and how much by choice? Could a child of an executioner redefine themselves, or would society always enforce the inherited pattern? The most unsettling aspect was not what the family did, but what could happen unexpectedly. A new magistrate might change regulations, a neighbor might reveal a secret, a child might make a misstep in public. The delicate equilibrium of marginal existence could be disrupted by chance or error. Families lived constantly at the edge of possibility, balancing survival against exposure. You might imagine that an executioner's tools were symbols of horror, gleaming, terrifying, and designed to inspire fear. In reality, they were far more mundane. They were instruments, meticulously maintained, designed for efficiency and precision. The quality of a blade or the strength of a rope determine the difference between swift justice and prolonged suffering. The life of an executioner revolved as much around maintenance as action. The first tool every executioner carried was the sword. It was usually heavy, blunt at the edges of popular imagination, but in truth crafted with exacting standards. Historical accounts describe swords that were balanced to the edge, sharpened to a precise angle, and inspected frequently. A dull sword was more than inconvenient. It was a professional failure. Failure meant public shame, potential injury to oneself, and, occasionally, violent backlash from the crowd. Sharpening the sword required skill, patience, and regular attention. Executioners learned to grind and polish edges, testing the balance by weight and swing. These preparations often took hours, and they were repeated even when no execution was scheduled, because a sword that failed unexpectedly could not be replaced in the moment. The process was quiet and methodical, a ritual in itself. Axes were another common tool, particularly for beheadings in Northern Europe. Unlike the sword, the axe demanded not only sharpness but also precise alignment and weight distribution. Executioners spent time ensuring that the handle fit comfortably, that the blade swung evenly, and that the wood was resistant to splintering. An improperly maintained axe could bounce, chip, or twist, prolonging the execution and creating chaos in front of a crowd. Ropes were equally significant. Hanging was one of the most common forms of execution, and a rope's integrity was essential. Executioners inspected fibers carefully, checking for fraying, moisture damage, or weak knots. They experimented with length, weight, and placement, often measuring repeatedly for consistency. Rope maintenance was less about cruelty and more about engineering. It required precision and foresight. Scaffolds themselves were part of the toolkit. A scaffold was a temporary structure, built to support both the executioner and the condemned. Executioners understood wood, joinery, and load distribution. Even a small miscalculation could collapse the structure, endangering multiple lives. During preparation, scaffolds were reinforced, nails tightened, planks smoothed, and platforms leveled. Every detail was recorded mentally and often in logs that resembled a craftsman's notes more than a chronicle of death. Cleaning and care of tools was equally crucial. Blood, sap, and environmental factors degraded instruments over time. Executioners removed residue, polished metal, dried ropes, and repaired handles. This was often done alone, in the quiet of early morning or late evening. The work was repetitive, almost meditative, and far less dramatic than public perception suggested. Beyond metal and wood, executioners relied on smaller, specialized implements. Knives for minor cuts or dissections, wedges for splitting, hooks for handling bodies, and even simple buckets for transporting materials were treated with precision. Each tool had a place, a purpose, and a routine for maintenance. Forgetting any step could have practical consequences and, occasionally, moral ones. Interestingly, executioners developed detailed knowledge of materials. Not all rope was equal, not all metal held an edge. Some woods absorbed moisture and weakened. Some stones were unstable under scaffolding. Through years of observation, trial, and error, executioners acquired what might be called material literacy, a deep, practical understanding that other townspeople rarely needed and seldom recognized. Maintenance was not merely functional. It carried social and psychological weight. A well-kept set of tools projected competence and reliability. Crowds, officials, and the condemned might not appreciate the preparation, but they recognized the results. Conversely, tools left neglected invited criticism and danger. Professional pride was intertwined with care, as was personal safety. Even in times of inactivity, tools demanded attention. The executioner sharpened, polished, and inspected regularly, as if rehearsal could ward off failure. This repetition became part of daily life, shaping the rhythm of mornings and evenings. It offered both comfort and burden, a sense of control in a world that otherwise imposed isolation, responsibility, and risk. Tools also reinforced the executioner's social position. They were symbols of authority and exclusion. Children watched them with awe and fear, neighbors observed them with suspicion, and town officials respected them with distance. Tools marked identity as much as they facilitated work. They were instruments of death and instruments of separation, a constant reminder that the executioner's life was not ordinary. And yet, for all their danger and symbolism, these tools were fundamentally practical. There was no magic in their shape, no inherent malevolence in their form. They were designed for a single purpose, and their effectiveness depended on routine, discipline, and care. In this quiet attention to detail, the executioner's life revealed its paradox. Surrounded by instruments of death, he found meaning in maintenance, order, and preparation rather than spectacle. The life of an executioner was, in many ways, measured in tools rather than hours. While the public only saw the final act, the sword raised, the rope taut, the axe swinging, most of his time was spent in preparation, maintenance, and quiet study. Each instrument demanded attention, and each demanded knowledge. Over time, the executioner's daily routine became inseparable from the objects he relied upon. Sharpening a sword or an axe was a meticulous process. It required steady hands, careful angles, and repeated testing. Executioners often practiced swings in empty fields or against sacrificial wood, refining muscle memory and ensuring precision. The goal was efficiency, one clean, conclusive motion that minimized suffering. Every repetition reinforced skill, but also reinforced isolation. Hours spent polishing and testing became hours apart from ordinary life, apart from conversation and companionship. Rope care was similarly exacting. A frayed strand could result in an incomplete hanging, a prolonged execution, and public outrage. Executioners examined every fiber, coiled ropes in precise patterns, and stored them in dry, well-ventilated areas. They measured tension, considered the weight of the condemned, and adjusted knots for consistency. This was knowledge passed from master to apprentice, from father to son, often carried out in near silence. Tools demanded not only physical attention but mental focus. Executioners developed an intuitive understanding of materials, learning which woods could bear weight for scaffolds, which metals held an edge best, and which fibers resisted moisture and wear. This knowledge was empirical, accumulated over years of observation, success, and failure. In a time before formal engineering or science, these practical insights were both rare and indispensable. Beyond the immediate instruments of death, secondary tools shaped daily survival. Buckets, brushes, and cloths were used to clean surfaces, remove residue, and maintain hygiene. Nails, hammers, and saws repaired scaffolds. Even mundane items became part of a ritual of care. Every object was treated as essential to the executioner's professional life and personal safety. Cleaning was never purely functional. It carried psychological weight. Blood and bodily fluids were reminders of mortality and responsibility. Executioners developed routines for cleaning that were methodical and repetitive, almost meditative. These acts helped maintain composure, reinforce skill, and create a sense of order in a life defined by social marginality and public fear. Maintenance also intersected with social perception. Well-kept tools reflected reliability. Officials, magistrates, and townspeople recognized competence, even if grudgingly. A dull blade, a frayed rope, or a rickety scaffold invited scrutiny, gossip, and occasionally violence. Tools became extensions of reputation. Neglect was not just practical failure, it was social failure. Apprenticeships within executioner families emphasized this dual responsibility. Young boys learned not only to swing an axe but to care for it. They observed their fathers polishing, repairing, and adjusting tools, and were expected to replicate this precision. The act of care became as much a lesson in discipline as the act of execution itself. Even in times without scheduled executions, tools demanded attention. Swords were oiled, ropes checked, scaffolds reinforced, knives sharpened. Repetition created familiarity and skill, but also reinforced isolation. The executioner's identity became inseparable from his implements. He measured his competence through their condition, his role through their readiness. Tools were also a boundary between life and death, work and family, public and private. They defined who he was to outsiders, feared, respected, and excluded. They defined who he was to himself, meticulous, disciplined, and quietly competent. In caring for them, he maintained control over the aspects of his life he could govern, even while society dictated much of the rest. Yet despite this careful attention, uncertainty remained. Tools could fail, materials could degrade unexpectedly, or methods could devolve. A rope might weaken in a damp winter. A sword might chip unexpectedly. A scaffold might settle unevenly under weight. These failures were rarely dramatic in books or chronicles, but they were deeply felt. Every mishap carried consequences, social, professional, and sometimes physical. And so, the tools of death were never merely instruments. They were companions, teachers, and mirrors. They shaped routines, informed judgment, and demanded constant vigilance. In their care, the executioner found structure, skill, and a quiet form of survival. Imagine a medieval town on a bright morning. Smoke drifts from bakery chimneys. Livestock bleats in pens. Merchants shout prices for bread, wool, and grain. Children run through narrow streets, and townspeople carry baskets to stalls. Amid the ordinary clamor, you notice a figure moving deliberately, calmly, yet unmistakably apart. This is the executioner, a man whose life usually unfolds on the margins, stepping carefully into the heart of daily commerce. Market days were not optional for the executioner. His presence was mandated by custom, necessity, or law. He had roles beyond the scaffold. Occasionally, he supervised the removal of animals that had died in the streets. Sometimes he assisted with public hygiene tasks that other townspeople avoided. And sometimes, simply by existing visibly in the marketplace, he reminded the town of order, law, and consequence. His appearance was a subtle reinforcement. Life and justice coexist, but only under the watch of the unacknowledged. Merchants reacted cautiously. A butcher might look up as he sold meat, hands pausing, aware that the executioner understood anatomy differently than ordinary people. A baker might maintain eye contact for seconds too long, or avoid it entirely. Children whispered or stared. Adults stepped aside, not out of respect, but out of discomfort. The executioner's stride was deliberate, his gaze forward, his interactions minimal. Every movement was measured, almost ritualistic. He carried no display of authority beyond his own presence. No badge, no symbol of office, just the quiet assurance that his reputation preceded him. Town officials rarely intervened to direct behavior. The social code was already understood. The executioner was part of public life, yet always outside of it. Preparation for market days began in advance. Tools were checked and stored safely. Clothing was cleaned, yet simple. Routes were planned to minimize prolonged exposure to the crowd. Time of arrival was calculated carefully. Executioners were aware that gossip traveled quickly, and that any misstep could reinforce stigma or invite embarrassment. Even a minor verbal exchange could ripple through the marketplace for days. Despite these precautions, the executioner's presence had a subtle authority. Children paused in their play. Dogs stopped barking. Merchants counted coins a little more carefully. It was not fear of immediate violence, but recognition of competence and inevitability. Justice, in some form, was tangible simply because he was there. Market days also required interaction with officials. Town clerks or magistrates sometimes needed signatures, reports, or confirmation that supplies for executions, scaffolds, or ropes were complete. These exchanges were brief, formal, and documented. They reinforced the executioner's role as an indispensable municipal functionary rather than a social equal. At the edges of the market, executioners observed patterns unnoticed by others. The flow of people, the placement of carts, the spacing of goods, all mattered when moving through crowded streets. Their observations were practical. Awareness prevented accidents with tools, animals, or themselves. They learned to navigate not only physical obstacles, but also social expectations. Avoidance and discretion became skills as essential as swordsmanship. Children sometimes dared to approach, curious about the man they had been warned to fear. Mothers called them back with gentle, anxious commands. Executioners did not react with anger, they understood. Part of their training, implicit and long learned, was emotional restraint. Every market day reinforced their dual identity, present but apart, acknowledged but avoided. Payment and official duties often intersected with these appearances. Some executioners collected fees or fines for secondary municipal work, delivered receipts, or oversaw enforcement of local regulations. Merchants might be required to witness certain rituals, inspection of weights, verification of goods, or demonstration of compliance with law. all under the quiet eye of the executioner. His presence lent authority without fanfare. Market days were also opportunities for small observations, quiet learning, and subtle influence. Executioners noted social tensions, disputes, and alliances. They saw which merchants were reliable, which neighbors whispered too loudly, and which children moved freely beyond bounds. This intelligence was informal, yet it shaped decisions regarding daily work, scheduling of executions, or even the handling of public complaints. And yet, market days were exhausting. Every interaction, no matter how brief, carried social weight. Every glance or whisper required management. After hours of careful navigation, the executioner returned to the margins, where tools awaited, and the rhythm of private labor resumed. Public life had been fulfilled, appearances maintained, authority reinforced, and dignity preserved, quietly, efficiently, invisibly. After the marketplace empties and the carts are packed away, the executioner reflects on the quiet patterns of observation he has practiced for years. Each market day is not merely a chore, it is an exercise in understanding human behavior. The crowd's reactions, subtle gestures, and whispered conversations all provide information. While others may see only a dull routine, the executioner's awareness is precise, trained, and constant. Social expectation is the heaviest load carried on these days. Townspeople expect his presence, yet simultaneously wish he would remain invisible. The executioner must balance visibility with discretion. A misstep, laughter at the wrong moment, a misdirected glance, a conversation extended beyond necessity, can spark gossip that follows him for months. Over time, these minor interactions become exercises in patience, emotional control, and anticipation. Official duties intersect with social pressures in complex ways. Payment for past services must be collected from magistrates, fines enforced, or supplies verified. Each of these tasks requires careful timing. Approaching officials too early can be seen as presumptuous, arriving too late appears negligent. The executioner's role is not ceremonial. It is functional, bureaucratic, and highly visible, but in the visibility itself, he must remain almost invisible in demeanor. Travel between the outskirts of town and the marketplace demands planning. Streets are narrow, crowded, and often uneven. The executioner must carry himself with awareness, not only to avoid accidents with animals and carts but also to avoid drawing unnecessary attention. Over years, this constant calculation becomes second nature, a rhythm learned by repetition, instinct, and necessity. Interactions with merchants are similarly delicate. A butcher may hand over coins, but eye contact is brief, a baker may nod, but voice remains low. Each exchange reinforces social boundaries. The executioner is present, yet apart, a living reminder of authority and consequence. Children approach with curiosity, yet mothers intervene before conversation begins. In all of this, restraint is a survival tool, protecting both reputation and personal safety. Market days also serve as informal intelligence gathering. Executioners note disputes that arise, carts placed in unsafe positions, goods that are misrepresented, and people whose actions signal dishonesty or unrest. This knowledge is practical. A merchant whose behavior is unpredictable may later require oversight, or an approaching stranger may signal potential danger. The market becomes a living classroom for observation and decision-making, quietly shaping municipal stability. The executioner's family, often accompanying him on these trips, learns the same lessons. Children practice awareness, noticing where to step, whom to avoid, and how to walk without drawing attention. For them, market days are part of education, teaching survival, discretion, and endurance. They understand that social invisibility, though imposed, can be mastered with skill. Weather, too, plays a practical role. Rain turns streets to mud, winds scatter goods, and heat exhausts those who carry heavy loads. Executioners must account for these factors, ensuring that tools, documents, and payments are secure, while navigating the unpredictable behavior of townspeople who are distracted or impatient. Each day in the market is both a test of competence and a rehearsal for more solemn duties. At the end of the day, the executioner returns to his margins, often walking past fields, fences, and empty paths, carrying with him a mental ledger of interactions, potential hazards, and social patterns. The marketplace's chaos fades into quiet, but the knowledge gained persists. In this silent accumulation, the executioner exercises a form of influence rarely acknowledged, shaping behavior without speech, maintaining order without force, and demonstrating authority simply through presence. Life as an executioner was not only about public appearances or tools of death. Behind the scenes, in the quiet of a small home beyond the city walls, there was a subtler, almost invisible education, one that combined cleanliness, medicine, and knowledge that others regarded with fear or suspicion. This was the knowledge of decay, of disease, and of the human body in its most practical and raw form. Children born into executioner families often learn these lessons first through observation. A father or uncle cleaned implements, disposed of animal carcasses, or handled wounds. The lessons were not framed as morality or religion, they were practical. Wash the blood. Sterilize the instruments. Dispose of the waste properly. The world beyond the town walls demanded cleanliness as a form of survival. Water, in particular, was a precious resource. Towns inside the walls had wells, fountains, and more predictable access to clean water. Outside, the executioner's household had to store, filter, and ration supplies carefully. Every chore, from washing cloths to cleaning floors to preparing food, required attention. This emphasis on cleanliness extended beyond hygiene. It was preventive medicine, an early understanding of how disease spreads, learned through necessity rather than theory. Medical knowledge was another dimension of life at the margins. Executioners often handled injuries, infections, and minor surgeries that other townspeople avoided. Cuts from tools, animal bites, burns, and broken bones required immediate attention. They learned to apply poultices, bandages, and splants. They observed the signs of infection, fever, and swelling. Sometimes, in desperation, they performed amputations, not for spectacle, but to save life. This knowledge had a social complexity. While townspeople feared executioners for their association with death, they sometimes relied on them in private for care that others would not touch. Gratitude was quiet, payment discreet. The executioner's medical role existed in parallel with his public role, unseen, undervalued, but essential. The family, too, absorbed these lessons, learning to manage sickness, assess danger, and act decisively. Curiously, much of this learning bordered on what authorities or clerics deemed forbidden. Handling corpses, observing injuries in detail, and practicing remedies in private were often viewed with suspicion. Executioners' households accumulated a type of knowledge both practical and dangerous, anatomical, hygienic, and sometimes chemical. Children learned, almost by osmosis, the precise measurement of substances for healing, or occasionally for removing life when sanctioned. This duality defined the household's rhythm. By day, chores and routine, cleaning, food preparation, maintenance. By night, quiet observation, study, and sometimes practice. Tools, herbs, and makeshift medical implements were handled with care. Knowledge was repeated, refined, and passed down carefully to prevent errors that could cause injury, shame, or legal trouble. Cleanliness itself was a layered practice. Floors, walls, and surfaces were scrubbed. But the deeper work involved attention to invisible threats, the spread of parasites, bacteria, and disease. Executioners observed symptoms that others ignored, noting fevers, rashes, and discharges. In a household accustomed to death and marginality, maintaining hygiene became a moral and practical imperative. Forbidden knowledge extended to anatomy. The executioner's family sometimes assisted with dissections or post-mortem examinations, rare and controversial acts that most townspeople avoided. Understanding the mechanics of the human body was crucial for precision in executions, but it also conferred practical expertise. Bones, tendons, and ligaments were studied quietly. Children learned to identify structures by touch, smell, and sight, gaining insight that few in society could claim without censure. Over time, this education shaped character. Patience, observation, meticulousness, and discretion were not optional, they were survival skills. Emotional resilience was trained alongside practical knowledge. Families developed a quiet understanding. The world feared what it did not understand, but that knowledge could also confer power, independence, and competence. The most profound aspect of this quiet learning was its invisibility. While townspeople celebrated priests, scholars, and merchants, executioners' families developed knowledge and skill without recognition. Their survival, competence, and sometimes life-saving abilities were rarely acknowledged publicly. Yet within the household, these lessons became a foundation for resilience, shaping identity and purpose even under the weight of stigma. The life of an executioner's family was defined by duality: presence in the world yet marginalization, public function yet private study. Within the walls of their modest home outside town, daily routines blended survival, observation, and preparation for responsibilities that society preferred to ignore. Every act of cleaning, every bandage applied, and every tool handled carried both practical and moral significance. Water was a constant concern. Wells were rare, streams often distant, and contamination common. The household developed routines that combined conservation and cleanliness. Laundry was done in stages, ensuring that soiled water did not contaminate drinking water. Floors were swept and scrubbed, but also disinfected using ashes, vinegar, or heated stones. These methods were empirical, learned through repeated observation, trial, and error. They were not prescribed by authority, they were developed out of necessity. Medicine was learned in parallel with these domestic chores. When a child cut themselves, the lessons began early: wash thoroughly, Bandage securely, monitor for infection. The executioner's spouse or children observed closely, internalizing the subtleties of wound care. Herbs were gathered and dried, poultices prepared, and minor procedures practiced cautiously. In a world without widespread formal medical knowledge, this household became a quiet repository of practical expertise. Perhaps most striking was the study of human anatomy. Executioners and their apprentices were often among the few in society who had close, regular access to bodies, whether from executions, accidents, or disease. They learned to distinguish muscle from tendon, artery from vein, without the benefit of formal education. In doing so, they developed an understanding of life and death that few could match. Knowledge was applied cautiously. A misplaced cut could cause unnecessary suffering, a misread symptom could result in death. Precision became a moral imperative as much as a professional one. Children absorbed this knowledge naturally, through observation, participation, and repetition. Tasks were assigned carefully: sweeping, preparing tools, measuring herbs, observing wounds. Every action was contextualized as necessary, deliberate, and controlled. Mistakes were corrected quietly, reinforcing both skill and discretion. Knowledge was power, but it was also a responsibility. Cleaning, medicine, and anatomical observation were not separated from broader survival skills. The household also managed food preservation, waste disposal, and environmental hazards. Meat was salted, grains stored in cool, dry conditions, and water boiled or filtered when possible. Rats, insects, and spoiled food were constant threats. Cleanliness and careful attention reduced risk, but also reinforced a philosophy of vigilance. Social perception shaped these activities. Townspeople feared executioners and their knowledge. Handling corpses, tending wounds, or discussing anatomy could provoke suspicion, rumors, or even accusations of sorcery. The household operated in careful balance. Skills were applied when necessary, but concealed when they could provoke harm. Children learned early the difference between practical action and public acknowledgement, between necessity and revelation. In addition, knowledge carried ethical weight. The household developed internal rules. Harm was sanctioned only when mandated by law. Care was provided to preserve life whenever possible, and secrecy was maintained to protect both practitioners and recipients. These rules were enforced quietly, often without discussion, creating a culture of disciplined, cautious morality. The combination of cleanliness, medicine, and forbidden knowledge shaped identity. Executioners and their families learned to observe without reaction, act decisively, and preserve order in small, private ways. They became invisible custodians of life and death, maintaining expertise that society neither celebrated nor trusted. Their education was practical, necessary, and morally complex, extending far beyond what most people experienced in ordinary households. Imagine standing on the scaffold, the rope coiled, the blade sharpened, and the condemned trembling at your feet. You are prepared. The law is prepared. But the street is unusually quiet. The usual murmurs, the gasps, the tense anticipation, none of it is there. The crowd has not arrived. The spectacle upon which your role depends has evaporated into silence. In medieval towns, public executions were social events, not merely punishments. Citizens gathered to witness justice, to see law enforced, to remind themselves of the consequences of crime. Their presence transformed death from an abstract concept into a communal lesson. For the executioner, the crowd's attention was as essential as his tools. Without it, the act became not only technical, but deeply disorienting. Why would a crowd refuse to watch? Several factors might contribute. Fear could play a role. Rumors of gruesome mishaps, disease outbreaks, or political tension kept people away. Social unrest or religious observances might alter attendance. In rare instances, disapproval of the punishment itself could manifest in absence. Whatever the reason, the effect was profound. The scaffold, prepared meticulously, seemed suddenly unnecessary. The executioner's role was defined not only by skill, but by an audience. Without witnesses, his work lost social meaning. The executioner learned early that the crowd was both a stabilizing and a validating force. Their whispers, their gasps, their careful observation reinforced the legitimacy of punishment. In their absence, the act felt hollow. Even the condemned sensed the change. A criminal awaiting execution could exhibit confusion, fear, or defiance, knowing that no one else was present to confirm the law. Without an audience, authority itself appeared fragile. In some cases, authorities attempted to compensate. Guards or officials might be asked to serve as substitutes, maintaining the appearance of legality. But their presence lacked the unpredictable, collective attention of townspeople. The executioner felt the difference acutely. Precision, care, and ritual persisted, but the emotional context, the validation of society, was missing. For families of executioners, these moments were equally unsettling. Children who had grown accustomed to routine and visibility observed the change quietly. They saw their parents' skill applied, yet without acknowledgement. The rhythms of preparation, the hours spent caring for tools, and the attention to detail all seemed, for a moment, unnecessary. Life beyond the walls, already defined by marginality, felt further isolated. Psychologically, absence magnified responsibility. Every action became its own justification. There was no social buffer, no indirect approval. A poorly executed act could not be explained away as unnoticed by the crowd. It would be remembered precisely because the few witnesses were the authorities themselves, not the indifferent public. The executioner had to rely entirely on mastery of technique, discipline, and composure. Interestingly, the absence of a crowd sometimes altered behavior in subtle ways. Executioners might adjust speed, posture, or method, aware that observation had shifted from many eyes to few. In some cases, this allowed quiet reflection or even minor innovation, changes that might not have been considered if an expectant crowd loomed. Yet these adaptations were cautious, because any failure, even in private, could have consequences. Over time, the executioner internalized lessons from such absences. Ritual and preparation became not only for the public, but for the work itself. The tools, scaffolds, and ropes gained meaning independent of witnesses. Precision, discipline, and attention to detail were reaffirmed as intrinsically valuable, not merely performative. Even in the absence of society, life demanded order. The scaffold stood ready, the tools polished, and the condemned prepared. Yet the absence of the crowd shifted the executioner's role from public performance to solitary responsibility. In these moments, the work was no longer validated externally. Every swing of the axe, every placement of the rope, Every careful adjustment of the scaffold rested entirely on his judgment. There were no murmurs to gauge approval, no collective gasp to confirm precision, only the silent weight of his own expertise. For an executioner, habituated to routine and observation, the absence of witnesses was disorienting. Preparation remained meticulous, the ropes measured, knots tested, blades sharpened, scaffolds checked for stability. But the usual rhythm of anticipatory noise, the bustling of townspeople, children whispering, merchants murmuring, was missing. Each moment of silence magnified responsibility, making every detail sharper, every error potentially more consequential. The condemned, too, felt the change. Many anticipated the spectacle as part of their punishment. Without the audience, fear transformed into confusion or defiance. Some spoke out, questioning why no one else had gathered. Others froze, unsure how to behave without social cues. The executioner, trained in control and precision, had to adjust. He could no longer rely on the implicit reinforcement of the crowd. Discipline and authority had to be projected through method and demeanor alone. Officials often filled in the gaps left by absence, but their presence lacked the chaotic, unpredictable authority of a populace. Magistrates and guards were formal, controlled, and predictable. They could validate legality, but they could not replicate the energy, the tension, or the subtle social reinforcement that ordinary townspeople provided. Without the crowd, the executioner's work became both more solemn and strangely private, his competence tested without the usual feedback loop. These absences were not common, but they were not rare either. Plagues, political unrest, or even seasonal changes could deter attendance. Executioners adapted gradually. The ritual of preparation took on a new meaning. It became an internalized rehearsal, emphasizing mastery over performance. Precision was necessary, not for display, but for survival, both of self and of the condemned. The psychological effects were subtle but pervasive. Executioners learned to measure authority internally, to rely on skill rather than observation for validation. The absence of a crowd heightened awareness of each detail, reinforced caution, and cultivated an almost meditative focus. It was as if the silence itself demanded attention, forcing the executioner to confront the moral, technical, and social dimensions of his work simultaneously. Families of executioners were aware of these changes too. Children watched from the margins, absorbing lessons not only in skill but in composure, discipline, and adaptation. Without the crowd, they learned that authority could be projected quietly, that competence did not require acknowledgement, and that moral responsibility existed independently of public validation. These lessons, though unspoken, became part of the family's inherited knowledge. Interestingly, absence sometimes allowed minor innovation. Executioners could experiment with knots, scaffold design, or the angle of a blade without public scrutiny. Yet these adaptations were cautious, mistakes were not forgiven, and reputations were still at stake within the small circle of authority. Trial and observation became a private form of education, reinforcing skill while minimizing risk. Even the tools themselves seemed to demand attention in the silence. Ropes were inspected with renewed care, blades honed to perfection, scaffolds double-checked. In the absence of witnesses, mistakes could no longer be masked by the crowd's distraction. Each tool became an extension of responsibility, an anchor for focus, and a means of maintaining control over unpredictable circumstances. And yet, this adaptation raised a deeper question: if the executioner's work is defined by both legality and social observation, what becomes of justice when society refuses to witness it? Does law maintain its authority, or does its power depend entirely on collective acknowledgement? In these silent markets and empty streets, the executioner discovered that social absence could be more powerful than any weapon he carried, because it forced both observer and participant to confront the meaning of responsibility, duty, and control in isolation. In medieval towns, an executioner's work was highly visible, but the rewards were quiet, measured, and often modest. Payment did not come in abundance or praise. Instead, it arrived in coins, in worn but serviceable clothing, and in the tacit acknowledgement that he had done his duty correctly. These forms of compensation were both practical and symbolic, shaping daily life as much as public action. Coins were straightforward but scarce. Executioners were paid for each act of public service: a hanging, a beheading, the maintenance of equipment, or the preparation of the scaffold. These payments, however, were often delayed by municipal bureaucracy, seasonal shortages, or human error. Families learned to budget carefully, stretching every coin to cover food, household repairs, and clothing. Luxury was rare, necessity dominated each transaction. Clothing, though less precise in value than coins, was another form of payment. Executioners received garments for public appearance, sturdy boots for travel between town and scaffold, and durable cloaks for protection against weather. These garments were rarely ornate, but they served a critical purpose: visibility without spectacle, protection without ostentation. Quality mattered because a tear, a worn strap, or a dirty cloak could undermine authority or invite ridicule. Clothes, in this sense, were both compensation and professional equipment. Silence was perhaps the most subtle form of payment. Respect, deference, and avoidance were socially enforced rewards for competence. When townspeople stepped aside, lowered their voices, or avoided unnecessary conversation, the executioner received acknowledgement without words. The absence of insult, confrontation, or interference confirmed social order. In a world that feared him yet depended on his function, silence became a currency as real as coin or cloth. The combination of these payments shaped the household's rhythms. Food, clothing, and shelter were practical concerns, managed carefully within narrow budgets. Maintenance of tools and preparation for work were constant responsibilities, funded by coins and facilitated by durable garments. Silence, meanwhile, provided psychological space, protection from gossip, judgment, or unwanted attention. These rewards were intertwined, inseparable from the marginality that defined the executioner's life. Transactions extended beyond formal payment. Merchants sometimes offered goods in lieu of coins: sacks of grain, cured meats, or barrels of ale. Magistrates might provide favors or exemptions from certain taxes. Each act was carefully recorded mentally, though rarely documented formally. Families understood the social economy: favor was fragile, recognition minimal, and stability dependent on discretion. Children learned early the subtleties of this economy. They observed when coins were counted, how clothing was repaired or patched, and how silence itself could signify approval. These lessons were practical and social. Competence and patience were rewarded indirectly, Missteps or ostentation could reduce or eliminate rewards. Survival depended on mastering these quiet signals. Interestingly, silence could carry weight far beyond payment. It enforced hierarchy and order. Townspeople avoided direct confrontation, maintained boundaries, and, in doing so, acknowledged authority without creating spectacle. The executioner's presence was felt not through applause or thanks, but through the careful management of everyday interactions. In a society obsessed with lineage, morality, and social positioning, silence became a subtle yet powerful form of reinforcement. Even the tools and garments were part of this economy. Properly maintained swords, ropes, and scaffolds ensured continued employment and reliable payment. Clothing served as both protection and symbol, confirming competence without fanfare. Families learned to view these objects not only as implements or apparel but as integral components of livelihood and survival. Yet there was a tension in this quiet system. Payment, though consistent, was rarely abundant. Recognition, though implied, was never overt. Families lived within narrow margins, dependent on the smallest forms of validation: a coin, a cloak, a nod, averted gaze. Life was measured in careful attention to routine, not in celebration. Even survival carried weight because the rewards of diligence were modest and often invisible. And so, the executioner's household operated within a delicate balance. Coins funded necessities. Clothing enabled duty. Silence affirmed skill. Together, these payments created an economy of survival and authority, subtle yet effective. Payment for an executioner was rarely straightforward. Coins arrived unpredictably, sometimes weeks after a scheduled execution, delayed by municipal bureaucracy, magistrates' accounting, or even seasonal scarcity. Families quickly learned to budget meticulously. Every coin had a purpose: flour, salt, repairs, firewood. Luxury was nearly non-existent. Survival depended on precision and foresight. The careful allocation of resources became a daily exercise in discipline, shaping the household's rhythm as thoroughly as the executioner's work shaped the town. Clothing played a dual role, both functional and symbolic. Heavy boots protected against uneven roads, cloaks shielded from rain and cold, gloves and aprons guarded hands and bodies from blood or waste. Garments were rarely decorative, yet their quality mattered. A torn cloak or frayed sleeve could signal sloppiness or incompetence, undermining authority in public and diminishing the subtle respect that society extended through silence. Repair and maintenance of clothing became routine chores, performed with patience and care, and often taught to children as part of early lessons in responsibility. Silence, however, was the most unusual form of compensation. Unlike coins or clothing, it could not be weighed, counted, or stored. Yet it carried significance as profound as any tangible reward. Avoidance, deference, and quiet acknowledgement from townspeople signaled social acceptance within strictly defined boundaries. Children noticed it early, neighbors did not speak unnecessarily, friends did not press too close, and officials deferred conversation. This silent acknowledgement confirmed the executioner's role in the social order, providing reassurance without celebration. The household learned to navigate all three forms of compensation simultaneously. Coins funded necessities, but required careful planning. Clothing enabled work and affirmed skill. Silence maintained safety and authority. Together, They formed a quiet economy in which each family member played a part. Children assisted with chores, repaired clothing, or observed social cues. Spouses managed budgets, prepared meals, and maintained household hygiene. The executioner focused on craft, tools, and duties. This economy extended beyond ordinary transactions. Merchants sometimes offered goods instead of coins, grain, cured meats, or firewood. Magistrates occasionally granted favors or exemptions from minor taxes. Payment was rarely generous, but it was structured to sustain daily life. Families learned to view compensation not only as material reward but as part of a social contract. Survival depended on prudence, discretion, and reliability. There was also a subtle moral dimension. Silence and avoidance could protect or punish. Respecting boundaries, maintaining composure, and demonstrating competence ensured continued access to coins and clothing. Any failure, public misstep, poorly repaired tools, or visible frustration could disrupt this quiet system. The household's well-being depended on maintaining order, discipline, and discretion at all times. Interestingly, these small payments also shaped identity. The family learned to see value in what others overlooked. Coins and garments were practical, yes, but mastery of social behavior, patience, and observation became equally vital. Children internalized lessons in restraint. A nod could speak louder than words, a careful gait could prevent gossip, and silence could communicate authority and skill. In this quiet economy, intangible rewards carried as much weight as the tangible ones. Even tools intersected with this rhythm. A well-maintained axe, rope, or sword ensured continued employment, which translated to coins, clothes, and silent acknowledgement. Tools, garments, and social cues became interdependent. Mastery of one reinforced the others. The household understood that every act, preparation, cleaning, observation, was part of a continuous feedback loop, sustaining life, work, and reputation. And yet, this rhythm carried tension. Rewards were modest, acknowledgement subtle, and error conspicuous. Survival required constant awareness, careful planning, and emotional control. Every coin saved, every garment repaired, and every silent interaction preserved the household's equilibrium. Life was measured not by abundance, but by the successful management of scarcity, marginalization, and routine. You might assume that the executioner's work ended with a clean swing of the sword, the tightening of a rope, or the fall of a trapdoor. In truth, his responsibilities often extended into darker, quieter corners of medieval justice, into interrogation chambers and torture rooms, where the line between enforcement and cruelty blurred under the guise of law. Torture was a regulated, if grim, instrument of authority. It was not applied randomly. Statutes dictated methods, timing, and acceptable limits. Executioners were trained in these protocols. They were instructed to inflict pain to extract information, not to kill outright, unless specifically ordered. In practice, this meant learning to measure pressure, tension, and duration with precision. Too little force, and the prisoner might resist. Too much, and life could be lost prematurely. Devices were specialized and meticulously maintained. Racks, thumbscrews, and stretching instruments required careful construction and repair. Metal surfaces were polished to avoid tearing flesh unnecessarily. Wood was treated to bear weight and resist splintering. Executioners learned to adjust mechanisms gradually, observing reactions, calibrating force, and ensuring compliance with the strict limits imposed by law. In this way, engineering skill intersected with grim human observation. Observation itself became a critical skill. The executioner watched minute signs, flinches, sweat, eye movement, tremors. These indicated both suffering and the potential for compliance. The task demanded patience, attention, and subtlety. Too harsh, and vital information could be lost. Too lenient, and the prisoner might not yield. Precision, rather than brute force, defined success. The ethical dimension weighed heavily. Executioners were rarely given discretion. They were expected to follow instructions from judges, magistrates, or officials. Yet each act of torture was morally ambiguous. Executioners lived with the knowledge that they were agents of state-sanctioned pain, responsible for applying suffering in exact doses. Over time, this created a quiet, persistent tension between duty, morality, and survival. Interrogation required more than physical tools. Language, observation, and psychological awareness were also instruments. An executioner noted hesitations, contradictions, and small gestures. In some cases, prisoners attempted to manipulate their tormentor through feigned suffering or misdirection. The executioner had to read both body and mind, blending technical skill with subtle interrogation techniques. Families of executioners lived in quiet awareness of these duties. Children observed tools being cleaned and stored but were rarely exposed to their full use. Spouses managed household matters while recognizing the darker aspects of their partner's profession. Within the home, conversations about morality, law, and duty were often muted or coded, reflecting both fear and respect for secrecy. Society, meanwhile, maintained a cautious distance. Torture chambers were hidden, visits controlled, and the executioner's identity carefully mediated. The townspeople depended on his skill but did not witness it directly. Rumors and fear reinforced marginalization, ensuring that the executioner remained an essential yet socially isolated figure. Silence and discretion became both protection and punishment. Even preparation demanded diligence. Instruments had to be oiled, wood reinforced, ropes measured. Mechanisms were checked daily. Mistakes in setup could result in unintended death or injury, both of which carried social and legal consequences. Precision was paramount, and the executioner's reputation depended as much on careful preparation as on actual application. Interestingly, the work shaped observation skills that transcended torture. Executioners became adept at reading human behavior in subtle ways, measuring reaction times, interpreting micro-expressions, and predicting physical endurance. These skills, learned in extreme contexts, often informed more mundane aspects of their lives, including social interactions, crowd observation, and household management. And yet, even with legal codification and careful protocol, a question lingered: if an executioner applies suffering as a tool of law, where does duty end and moral responsibility begin? In the quiet shadow between compliance and cruelty, the answer is never clear, and perhaps that ambiguity is the heaviest burden of all. Beyond the scaffold, the executioner entered spaces where the weight of authority and secrecy was nearly absolute. Torture chambers were small, dimly lit, and carefully guarded. Here, the act of inflicting suffering was regulated with precision. but the psychological strain on the executioner was substantial. Every toolie, every motion, every adjustment was observed, recorded, and, at least indirectly, judged by both officials and the law. Success required exactitude, patience, and emotional control. One of the most crucial skills was measurement of pain, endurance, and reaction. The executioner observed the subtle cues of the body: tightening of muscles, trembling, gasps, beads of sweat forming along the forehead. These signals allowed him to gauge whether the applied force was sufficient to compel cooperation without causing premature injury or death. His instruments, rags, thumbscrews, stretching devices, and iron collars, were calibrated with care, each adjustment precise to the millimeter, the fraction of a turn, or the angle of pull. Precision was not only technical, it was moral. Time itself became a tool. Duration of exposure to pain was strictly regulated, often dictated by law or magistrate's orders. Too short, and the prisoner might resist; too long, and death could occur unexpectedly, undermining legal procedure. Executioners learned to internalize clocks, measuring moments with intuition sharpened by experience. Even a second of error could have lasting consequences for the prisoner, the official, and the executioner himself. Psychological observation was equally vital. Many prisoners attempted to manipulate, deceive, or mislead. Averted gaze, sudden shivering, or feigned fainting could indicate either submission or resistance. The executioner had to discern intent, balancing firmness with caution. Misreading a signal could prolong suffering unnecessarily, provoke panic, or render the interrogation ineffective. In this way, torture was as much about interpretation as it was about instruments. Families remained largely shielded from the full reality, but the shadow of the executioner's work touched daily life. Children learned to recognize the importance of silence, discretion, and emotional restraint. Spouses managed households while understanding that the head of the home bore burdens the world neither acknowledged nor could fully comprehend. Knowledge of danger, discretion in conversation, and careful management of the home became intertwined with survival. Torture also demanded preparation beyond immediate technique. Tools had to be cleaned, maintained, and stored securely. Chains were oiled, wooden frames reinforced, ropes inspected. Instruments of pain were also instruments of accountability. Any failure in setup could cause injury, provoke scandal, or result in personal punishment. Mastery of tools became inseparable from professional and social survival. Despite the grim nature of the work, executioners developed unique forms of insight. They became experts at reading human behavior under extreme duress, understanding endurance, fear, and response. These skills, while learned in morally challenging contexts, informed daily interactions, market observations, and the management of household or apprentices. Observation, patience, and subtle judgment became second nature, forming a quiet, practical intelligence rarely acknowledged by society. Yet ethical tension was constant. The executioner knew that each act of infliction, though legally sanctioned, carried moral weight. Responsibility for the prisoner's suffering was absolute in the moment of application, and yet mediated by instruction. Obedience to law did not absolve the psychological burden. Even long after tools were cleaned and chambers emptied, executioners carried the silent memory of their work, a quiet shadow woven into every decision. Over time, This duality shaped identity. The executioner became skilled, disciplined, and observant, necessary traits for both life and survival, but also morally and emotionally burdened. His profession demanded detachment in action, but reflection and awareness in the aftermath. Social isolation, fear, and stigma amplified the psychological weight, reinforcing the household's quiet routines of discretion, teaching, and careful preparation. Before the scaffold, the rope, or the axe ever came into use, the condemned often participated in a series of religious rituals, quiet, prescribed, and deeply structured. In medieval Europe, the intertwining of law and faith meant that death was not merely a physical end but a spiritual transition, one mediated by priests, clerics, and, indirectly, the executioner himself. The process began with confession. A condemned person was led to a small chamber or temporary space near the scaffold, where a priest awaited. Confession was a formal ritual, carefully guided by questions designed to elicit admission of sins, reflection on wrongdoing, and repentance. The executioner often stood silently nearby, neither interfering nor intruding, yet aware that his presence was a tacit acknowledgement of order and inevitability. After confession came prayer. Clerics recited prescribed passages, sometimes aloud, sometimes whispered. Condemned men and women knelt, hands folded, heads bowed. Executioners learned to respect these moments of solemnity. They did not participate directly, but they observed carefully, ensuring that tools were ready, scaffolds stable, and ropes measured. Their attention was divided, one part on spiritual propriety, the other on practical preparation. In some towns, the ritual extended to absolution or anointing with holy oils. Priests might perform small rites, bless garments, or sprinkle water. Executioners were instructed to wait silently, moving only when necessary. Every motion, however small, had significance. A misplaced step or careless adjustment could disrupt the ritual, offend religious sensibilities, or undermine the social and spiritual legitimacy of the punishment. The condemned themselves experienced a mix of fear, relief, and introspection. Religious rituals offered a framework for understanding impending death. Some found comfort in absolution, believing that confession and prayer might ease their passage to the afterlife. Others felt frustration or skepticism, aware that spiritual rituals did not alter the inevitability of the executioner's task. In these quiet moments, the executioner witnessed human emotion stripped of all pretense: sorrow, fear, resignation, and occasionally defiance. Silence was a constant companion. Crowds were kept at a distance during these rites, allowing for focus, respect, and reflection. Executioners were trained to match this quiet, moving only when required, speaking only when necessary. Their presence was functional yet symbolic, bridging the secular act of execution with the sacred rites surrounding it. Sometimes, instruments themselves were blessed or handled with ritual care. Ropes were inspected for integrity, axes polished, and platforms swept clean, not merely for function, but for spiritual propriety. The belief that the condemned deserved a dignified passage extended even to tools, emphasizing that death, though inevitable, was part of a larger moral and religious framework. Families of executioners understood this duality as part of their life on the margins. They recognized that their household's work was entwined not only with civic law but also with spiritual duty. Children observed preparation, learned to maintain instruments meticulously, and developed an understanding of ritual respect that blended duty, discretion, and moral awareness. Even in small towns, clerics and executioners maintained a complex relationship. The priest provided spiritual authority, offering absolution and guidance, while the executioner provided the practical reality of mortality. Coordination was necessary: timing of prayers, positioning of the condemned, readiness of instruments, all had to align seamlessly. Misalignment could offend faith, disrupt protocol, or provoke tension between civic and spiritual authority. And yet, for all the structure and solemnity, ambiguity remained. The executioner was an agent of law, but he was also an observer of faith, morality, and human vulnerability. He could measure ropes, sharpen blades, and steady scaffolds, but he could not absolve sins, comfort souls, or reconcile the moral weight of life taken. In this quiet, hovering space between earthly authority and divine expectation, the executioner operated with precision, discretion, and deep awareness of human fragility. As the ritual drew to its conclusion, prayers whispered, confessions completed, absolution given, the final moments approached. The condemned, spiritually prepared but physically exposed, looked to the scaffold, to the tools, and to the executioner. And the executioner, trained to act with calm efficiency, waited for the precise moment to transition from ritual to reality. After the prayers concluded and absolution was granted, the executioner's role shifted subtly but profoundly. The sacred space of confession and blessing gave way to the practical and unavoidable work of death. The scaffold, ropes, and blade now demanded precise attention, yet the memory of ritual lingered. Every movement carried dual meaning, functional efficiency and symbolic respect for the life that was about to end. Executioners learned early that timing was critical. Tools had to be ready before the ritual's conclusion, ropes tested for elasticity, platforms checked for stability. Even a small delay could disrupt the carefully choreographed interaction between cleric, condemned, and executioner. The seamless transition from ritual to action became a form of mastery, combining mechanical precision with social and spiritual sensitivity. Observation remained central. The executioner watched not only the condemned's physical posture, how they stood, trembled, or shifted, but also the lingering effects of ritual. Confession might calm a fearful heart, absolution might induce stillness, and the final prayers could bring fleeting clarity or resignation. The executioner's skill lay in interpreting these subtle cues, ensuring that the act proceeded without incident while maintaining dignity and order. The tools themselves were not mere instruments. They were extensions of authority and care. Axes were sharpened to minimize unnecessary struggle, ropes measured to avoid painful errors, platforms reinforced to ensure safe operation. Even the act of handling instruments carried ritual significance. Executioners moved deliberately, understanding that careless motion could not only jeopardize function but also violate the quiet solemnity of the preceding rites. In this transitional space, silence was both expectation and shield. The executioner spoke rarely, only to instruct or to coordinate. Any misstep in speech or gesture could disrupt focus, undermine authority, or disturb the spiritual ambience. Families of executioners, often on the margins of these moments, observed the discipline required, how restrained, observation, and meticulous care combined into professional and moral competence. The executioner also bore witness to the human vulnerability of the condemned. Faces reflected fear, acceptance, or disbelief, hands trembled or clenched, eyes flicked to the crowd or to heaven. Each gesture was noted silently, a record of humanity confronting mortality. The executioner's responsibility was absolute, yet he could neither alleviate fear nor provide spiritual consolation. His role was to enact law with precision, respecting ritual without assuming its spiritual authority. Even mundane preparation became ritualized. The placement of tools, the alignment of the scaffold, and the careful handling of ropes became second nature, almost ceremonial in their precision. Executioners treated these steps with reverence, understanding that the transition from ritual to death required both skill and solemnity. Mastery was not only technical but moral, ensuring that the condemned's final moments were handled with order and respect. And yet, despite all preparation, tension persisted. Executioners were acutely aware that ritual, while providing a framework, did not absolve the act itself. Each final movement, the tightening of a rope, the swing of a blade, remained a moral and practical responsibility. Their skill, discipline, and attention to detail were the only safeguards against chaos, error, or unnecessary suffering. In these moments, the executioner inhabited a liminal space, between law and faith, life and death, public duty and private conscience. His actions were mechanical, yet morally charged, efficient, yet profoundly human. Precision, restraint, and observation became inseparable from ethics, shaping both professional identity and personal reflection. For an executioner, repetition was both a necessity and a burden. Unlike a singular, dramatic event, executions were often scheduled with regularity, weekly, monthly, or as determined by the magistrates. Each act, preparing the scaffold, testing ropes, polishing blades, reading legal mandates, required precision. Yet over time these tasks became familiar. Familiarity, however, brought complexity, efficiency improved, but emotional detachment became a survival mechanism. Repetition trained muscle memory, but it also conditioned the mind. Executioners developed habits that allowed them to act swiftly and correctly, even when confronted with fear, struggle, or unexpected resistance. The tightening of a rope, the alignment of a platform, the sharpening of a blade, all were repeated with methodical attention. Practice reduced terror, but it also blurred the line between routine and ritual, life and death. Children in executioner households observed this rhythm quietly. They learned that skill required repetition, that mastery was built through practice, and that emotional regulation was essential. Early chores, cleaning tools, checking equipment, or assisting in preparation, taught patience, attention to detail, and an understanding of the consequences of error. Repetition was education, discipline, and preparation all at once. Yet psychological fatigue was inevitable. Even with proficiency, each act of execution carried weight. Witnessing life end, even under lawful sanction, produced subtle but persistent stress. Executioners developed strategies, mental compartmentalization, ritualized steps, or internalized counting, to maintain focus and prevent emotional overwhelm. The mind learned to function within a controlled framework, where observation and action were separated from reflection and morality. Interestingly, repetition reinforced both skill and identity. Executioners came to see themselves through the lens of competence. The quiet assurance that every rope was tested, every blade sharpened, every platform stable. This confidence was necessary for survival, both practical and social. Yet it also reinforced marginality. The more proficient they became, the more indispensable they were to society, and simultaneously, the further they were set apart from it. Society itself relied on repetition to reinforce order. Weekly or periodic executions reminded townspeople of law and consequence. Crowds gathered predictably, rituals followed routine, officials observed patterns. The executioner, operating at the center of this cycle, became a pivot point between law, ritual, and social reinforcement. Every repetition maintained both authority and fear. Yet monotony carried hidden danger. Familiarity could dull awareness, creating small but potentially fatal lapses. Tools might be overlooked, procedures skipped, or rituals performed hastily. The mind, conditioned to routine, required constant vigilance. Families understood this implicitly. Children were taught early that focus could never lapse, that small errors had disproportionate consequences, and that the discipline of repetition was both protection and responsibility. Repetition also influenced perception of the condemned. With every scheduled execution, the individual humanity of the condemned could fade into procedural abstraction. Executioners learned to balance empathy with detachment, acknowledging suffering without allowing it to compromise efficiency or legal compliance. This balance was fragile, maintained through habit, self-discipline, and the constant rhythm of work. Even beyond skill and mental discipline, repetition shaped worldview. Life, death, and justice were no longer abstract concepts, they were daily routines, observed, managed, and enacted with mechanical precision. The repeated act of execution normalized confrontation with mortality, instilled a sense of order amid chaos, and, paradoxically, created a mental space where detachment was necessary for survival. Yet repetition also sparked reflection. Between executions, executioners often contemplated their role, the moral dimensions of sanctioned death, and the subtle dynamics of social dependence, respect, and fear. The rhythm of work allowed moments for introspection, but never indulgence. Life in the margins demanded continuous awareness, self-regulation, and resilience. For an executioner, every act depended on precision, preparation, and timing. Ropes were measured, blades sharpened, platforms reinforced, and procedures rehearsed. Yet even the most meticulous planning could fail. A rope frayed, a mechanism jammed, a blade dulled or misplaced. Any small error could transform a public execution into a spectacle of chaos, confusion, and anger. Failure was rare, but the consequences were immediate and often dangerous. Medieval towns took executions seriously, they were both legal and social rituals. Citizens gathered to witness justice, expecting a clear demonstration of law. When an execution did not go as planned, when a condemned person survived a hanging, resisted a beheading, or fell in an unintended manner, the crowd's confidence in authority wavered. What was meant to reinforce law and order suddenly appeared flawed, unstable, or even corruptible. Public anger was swift. Shouts rang through the streets, fingers pointed, and whispers of incompetence spread quickly. Executioners, already marginalized, were exposed to scrutiny and suspicion. Even if survival was accidental or mechanical, the executioner was held accountable. The precision of the work was inseparable from trust in the office itself. A failure challenged not only the individual's skill but the legitimacy of the system. Authorities responded cautiously but decisively. Magistrates inspected equipment, questioned the executioner, and sometimes delayed further executions until confidence was restored. Crowds demanded explanation or retribution, while officials balanced public expectation with procedural law. Executioners navigated this tension carefully, knowing that missteps could cost social standing, wages, or even personal safety. The condemned themselves often exploited such moments. Survival might embolden defiance, inspire appeals for clemency, or provoke negotiations with officials. Executioners had to adapt quickly, maintaining composure while responding to both technical challenges and unpredictable human behavior. The delicate interplay of authority, law, and skill became painfully evident. Families observed these events with apprehension. Children who had learned routines, timing, and discipline saw the consequences of small errors magnified. Spouses worried about social censure, financial penalties, or potential violence. The household learned that preparation was never sufficient on its own. Vigilance, adaptability, and psychological resilience were equally necessary. Failure also carried long-term effects. Executioners' reputations, once tainted, could be difficult to restore. Townspeople remembered errors, sometimes exaggerating them through rumor. Tools were scrutinized more closely, rituals adjusted, and training intensified. Every subsequent execution became both a test of skill and a demonstration of regained credibility. Psychologically, failed executions weighed heavily. Executioners were aware that even unintended survival might spark chaos, anger, or moral questioning among the crowd. They had to manage personal responsibility, public perception, and technical recovery simultaneously. Repetition, discipline, and attention to detail became survival strategies not only for physical work but for social and psychological stability. Interestingly, failure sometimes offered lessons. Equipment could be improved, procedures refined, and observation skills heightened. Executioners often became more meticulous after a mishap, internalizing knowledge in ways that enhanced both precision and authority. Yet the shadow of public anger remained, a constant reminder of the fragile balance between law, perception, and the inevitability of human error. Even in quiet reflection, executioners understood the moral and social implications. A failed act of death was not simply a technical problem, it was a disruption of ritual, an interruption of justice, and a moment when law appeared fallible. Each misstep invited scrutiny of skill, ethics, and societal norms, forcing both executioner and community to confront the human dimensions of mortality. In medieval Europe, the role of executioner was overwhelmingly male, tied as it was to physical labor, social marginality, and legal responsibility. Yet, historical records reveal rare exceptions, women who assumed the role under unusual circumstances, often stepping into the position out of necessity, inheritance, or marital association. The most common pathway was through family. Executioner positions were frequently hereditary, passing from father to son. If no male heir was available, a widow might inherit her husband's responsibilities. In these cases, a woman assumed the role not out of desire but out of obligation, ensuring household income, maintaining civic duties, and upholding legal continuity. Historical accounts describe women managing instruments, preparing scaffolds, and, occasionally, performing executions themselves. Training was pragmatic and immediate. Women learned technical skills, rope handling, blade maintenance, scaffold construction, from male relatives or through apprenticeships. The work demanded physical competence, precise observation, and procedural discipline. Even in rare cases of direct execution, women approached the task methodically, relying on learned routines, careful preparation, and the same professional detachment expected of male counterparts. Social perception was complex. Communities were often uneasy with female executioners. Gendered expectations suggested that women were morally or physically unsuited for the work, which required both strength and psychological detachment. Yet necessity tempered prejudice. Townspeople relied on the widow, sister, or daughter to continue an established role, often treating her with a mixture of curiosity, wariness, and grudging respect. Legal authority was similarly constrained. Courts and magistrates often hesitated to formally appoint women, but practical considerations, household continuity, municipal need, or absence of male heirs, overrode prejudice. Female executioners were rarely formally celebrated. Their appointments were tolerated rather than endorsed, framed as expedient rather than aspirational. Daily life reflected both opportunity and marginalization. Women who assumed the role managed household income, supervised apprentices, and maintained tools with meticulous care. They faced the dual burden of social isolation and physical labor, navigating responsibilities that were unusual, stigmatized, and morally complex. Their presence challenged normative gender roles, yet also highlighted the pragmatic flexibility of law and society when necessity demanded it. Execution itself remained a rare task. Many female executioners delegated direct action to assistants, apprentices, or other laborers, focusing instead on preparation, observation, and ritual coordination. When compelled to act, they performed with care, precision, and methodical detachment, skills honed through observation and necessity rather than societal expectation. Psychologically, women in the role navigated tension between social marginality and professional obligation. They bore the same moral weight as male executioners, confronting fear, resentment, and scrutiny while maintaining competence and composure. Children in these households observed the same lessons of discipline, preparation, and attention to detail, gaining insight into both gendered roles and professional expectation. In some exceptional cases, women became respected for their efficiency, discipline, and composure. Their rarity amplified public attention, yet competence often earned grudging acceptance. Historical records describe widows or daughters who served decades, carefully balancing professional necessity with social caution, illustrating that skill, not gender, defined success in this grim occupation. Yet, the rarity of female executioners underscores broader social patterns. Labor, authority, and stigma were gendered, and stepping into male-dominated roles required extraordinary circumstances. Women were tolerated as executioners only when societal need outweighed prejudice, reflecting both flexibility and limitation in medieval social structures. Executioners were rarely young men at the beginning of their careers, yet even those in the prime of life faced the slow, unavoidable effects of time and physical strain. Years of lifting heavy tools, Climbing scaffolds, bending over platforms, and managing instruments exacted a quiet but persistent toll. Muscles stiffened, joints ached, and reflexes slowed. Even the most disciplined executioner could not escape the inevitability of aging. Injury was an ever-present risk. Axes, hammers, and scaffolds were heavy, unforgiving, and often poorly engineered by modern standards. A slip on a wet platform, a misjudged swing, or an accident during preparation could cause lasting damage. Families learned to treat these injuries seriously. A sprained ankle could limit mobility for weeks, a cut or puncture could result in infection, a back injury could compromise the ability to lift ropes or position instruments. Even minor injuries had outsized effects because the work required constant physical precision. The household adapted. Children took on more chores, learning tools, preparation, and careful observation earlier than they might have otherwise. Spouses managed not only household needs but also physical support for the executioner, fetching water, carrying supplies, and maintaining clothing and equipment when strength faltered. Aging and injury required collaboration and vigilance. The quiet economy of coins, clothing, and silence became even more essential as physical capacity diminished. Work patterns shifted subtly with age. Executioners learned to rely more heavily on planning, observation, and mental preparation. Tasks that once demanded brute strength were compensated for with experience. Ropes could be positioned strategically, platforms inspected carefully, and instruments maintained proactively. Efficiency increasingly depended on knowledge rather than pure physicality. Injuries often had social consequences as well. A misstep during execution could lead to public criticism or suspicion. Townspeople and magistrates expected precision and competence. Visible weakness or hesitation could provoke rumors of incompetence or even calls for replacement. Families lived under quiet pressure, aware that declining physical ability could threaten not only livelihood but also social safety. Replacement was an inevitability. Executioners were rarely in office for life, yet the transition was rarely smooth. Training a successor involved subtle balance, teaching technical skills, explaining procedural nuances, and imparting lessons in social management and moral restraint. The outgoing executioner also had to maintain authority during this period, ensuring that the town's confidence in law and ritual remained intact. Succession was not only a technical matter but also a social one. Communities were wary of new executioners, and trust had to be earned through demonstration of skill, discipline, and discretion. Mistakes by a novice could provoke anger, fear, or scandal, as the delicate rhythm of law, ritual, and social perception was disrupted. The older executioner often served as both teacher and overseer, mitigating risk while gradually transferring responsibility. Psychologically, aging and injury prompted reflection. Executioners contemplated the passage of time, their own mortality, and the transience of skill. Each injury, each creak of a joint, reminded them that physical competence was temporary, and that reputation, ritual understanding, and social acumen were equally critical for survival. Knowledge, observation, and judgment became as vital as muscle and reflex. Even in retirement or semi-retirement, executioners were not entirely removed from the rhythm of work. They might be consulted, assist in preparation, or observe successors, offering subtle guidance without intervening directly. Their presence provided continuity, reassurance, and stability, quietly preserving the social and moral order that depended on competence, discipline, and discretion. In medieval society, death was rarely impersonal. Even criminals condemned for heinous crimes often experienced ritual, confession, and public acknowledgement. Scaffolds were constructed, clerics attended, and crowds witnessed law enforced. Yet there existed a harsher, quieter category of execution, death without honor. These were lives erased in the shadows, removed from ritual and ceremony, often forgotten by both law and community. Such executions occurred for those deemed unworthy of formal procedure, deserters, heretics, traitors, or those executed under emergency authority. They might be left in unmarked pits, hanged in isolated areas, or dispatched quickly to avoid attention. The executioner carried out these tasks with minimal visibility, performing the act efficiently, without ritual, and without acknowledgement. The work was mechanical, clinical, and socially invisible. The tools were the same: axes, ropes, blades, but their use was stripped of ceremony. Preparation was functional rather than symbolic: ropes measured, scaffolds minimal or improvised, instruments checked simply for reliability. There was no priest, no ritual blessing, no moment of absolution. The executioner operated as a technician of death rather than a participant in social or spiritual order. Families of executioners understood the significance of these tasks. Children and spouses learned that some deaths carried social weight, and others did not. Silence was deeper here, not just expected but required. Conversations about these executions were rare. Acknowledgement could attract unwanted attention or moral scrutiny. The household understood that discretion protected both the living and the fragile social balance of marginal occupation. The condemned themselves faced a particularly stark reality. Denied ritual, ceremony, or witness, their deaths offered no comfort, no absolution, and often no memory beyond the immediate act. Death became a purely functional event, a transition without acknowledgement, stripped of dignity or social recognition. Even in death, humanity was minimized. Public perception was shaped by both fear and distance. Death without honor reinforced social boundaries. The condemned were outsiders, invisible in life and erased in death. The executioner's work was essential, yet socially hazardous. Carrying out such acts required precision, discipline, and psychological detachment. One misstep could draw suspicion, moral judgment, or even censure from authorities wary of irregularities. Interestingly, these executions highlighted the broader social function of ritual and acknowledgement. Formal ceremonies, confession, and clerical oversight framed death in a moral and communal context. Removing these elements created a stark contrast. Death became isolated, functional, and anonymous. Executioners understood this, navigating both technical demands and moral weight without guidance or social reinforcement. Even the preparation carried psychological consequences. The act's invisibility required strict discipline, tools prepared silently, ropes adjusted with care, platforms inspected with precision. The executioner's focus was entirely functional, yet moral reflection was unavoidable. To carry out death without honor demanded compartmentalization, experience, and a subtle awareness of social marginality. And yet, the practice raised difficult questions. If ritual and acknowledgement confer dignity, what becomes of a life erased in secrecy? Does the act of efficient, Unceremonious death diminished the humanity of both the condemned and the executioner, and in a society structured around law, ritual, and visibility, what moral authority can exist when death occurs beyond recognition? In the shadows of medieval towns, such deaths occurred quietly, efficiently, and without fanfare. They left few traces in public record, but their presence shaped the work, conscience, and identity of executioners. In these moments, the profession's margin became starkly visible. The executioner was essential, feared, and isolated. The condemned were erased, invisible, and denied both ritual and honor. The life of an executioner was socially isolated, morally burdensome, and physically demanding. Some individuals, after years or decades of service, sought to abandon the role. Yet leaving was far more difficult than one might imagine. Medieval society rarely allowed an executioner to simply retire. Towns depended on their services, families were intertwined with the occupation, and social stigma followed them wherever they went. A would-be retiree faced practical barriers first. Employment as an executioner often came with housing, access to tools, and municipal payments. Abandoning the post meant giving up both income and social protection. Trades outside the profession were limited. Few employers were willing to hire a man, or woman, whose work involved death, instruments of execution, and socially taboo tasks. The household economy, structured around coins, goods, and silence, often depended entirely on the executioner's work. Leaving could imperil the family's survival. Social barriers were even more formidable. Executioners were marked by their profession, both visually and socially. Families and neighbors knew the work and often refused to associate closely, creating persistent isolation. Even after leaving, suspicion and fear followed them. People whispered, children avoided them, and old acquaintances regarded them with a mixture of fear and curiosity. The stigma persisted, tethering the former executioner to the identity they had tried to abandon. Legal constraints complicated matters as well. In some towns, municipal regulations required continuity. A replacement could not be hired until the current executioner formally resigned or died. Leaving prematurely could incur fines, legal disputes, or pressure from authorities. In certain regions, executioners were bound by contract or guild-like obligations that limited personal choice. Escaping the role was not only socially difficult but legally constrained. Some attempted partial escape. Executioners might delegate more work to assistants or apprentices, gradually stepping back from direct involvement. Yet full separation remained rare. Even when physically absent from executions, they often retained social responsibility. Townspeople expected guidance, oversight, or instruction for successors. The past, in effect, never fully released them from its obligations. Psychologically, the desire to leave reflected accumulated strain. Years of repeated executions, moral weight, and social isolation created fatigue, emotional burden, and sometimes despair. Executioners who tried to abandon their role often described a longing for normality, ordinary work, community participation, or even anonymity. Yet the very skills that made them indispensable, discipline, precision, knowledge of law, and social navigation, also tethered them to the role. Their expertise was a chain as much as it was a livelihood. Families experienced the tension acutely. Children and spouses sometimes supported departure, seeing the toll of the profession on health and morale. Yet practical concerns, income, social survival, and reputation, often tempered ambition. Leaving could endanger household stability, forcing compromises between moral desire and survival instinct. Historical accounts reveal a range of outcomes. Some executioners successfully retired, often relocating to distant towns, taking minor trades, or living quietly on pensions or municipal allowances. Others were compelled to return after a short absence, either by legal mandate or social pressure. A few became marginalized entirely, wandering as socially stigmatized outsiders, carrying both expertise and social burden with them. In all cases, the tension between personal agency and societal expectation was profound. The executioner's skill, essential to law and order, bound him to the role even when the desire to leave was strong. Escape was possible, but it required planning, luck, and social negotiation, rarely a simple matter of walking away. The role of the executioner, once essential to the machinery of medieval law, did not vanish suddenly. Its disappearance was gradual, driven by shifts in law, social perception, and technology. Executioners, once visible instruments of justice and fear, became increasingly obsolete as societies restructured their methods of punishment and as centralized authority reduced reliance on public displays of violence. One of the earliest pressures came from changes in legal philosophy. During the late Middle Ages and into the Renaissance, jurists and legislators began emphasizing codified law, procedural fairness, and standardized sentencing. The spectacle of public execution was increasingly questioned, both for its morality and its efficacy as a deterrent. Philosophers, clerics, and emerging legal theorists argued that justice could be enforced without constant recourse to extreme violence, and that death should be reserved for the most serious crimes. These shifts directly affected executioners. Towns reduced the frequency of public hangings, beheadings, and other extreme punishments. When executions occurred, magistrates often sought to minimize spectacle. Crowds were limited, rituals shortened, and instruments simplified. The professional expertise of executioners was still required, but the role's visibility, and its associated social stigma, began to diminish. Technological changes also played a part. Improvements in prison architecture allowed for long-term confinement and alternative punishments. Stocks, pillories, fines, and other forms of discipline reduced the need for constant death as public enforcement. Executioners, once central to law enforcement, found that their specialized skills were increasingly underutilized. Rope, axe, and block were no longer the pillars of civic authority. Social perception shifted in tandem. Communities that had once relied on executioners as essential agents of justice began to regard them with increased ambivalence, or outright disdain. The stigma that had long defined the profession persisted, but the role's necessity diminished. Executioners became rarer, often retained only because tradition dictated their presence, rather than because society demanded it. In some towns, executioners were gradually absorbed into municipal bureaucracy or replaced by temporary contractors. Rather than a permanent, socially isolated profession, the task of executions became episodic, outsourced, or delegated to military or law enforcement personnel. The household, once centered around preparation, tools, and ritual competence, slowly adapted to more conventional work, reintegrating into broader community life. Legal centralization accelerated decline. As monarchs and regional authorities consolidated power, local executioners were replaced by official agents of the state. Central courts dispatched specialists for high-profile cases, reducing reliance on local executioners whose skill had been developed over decades of daily practice. The profession became rarer, its expertise less crucial, and its social isolation more acute for those who remained. Even the moral and ethical climate contributed. Religious authorities increasingly emphasized redemption, reconciliation, and humane treatment of prisoners. The theological justification for extreme public punishment waned. Executioners, whose work had been both legally sanctioned and morally justified, found their role morally questioned. The weight of societal scrutiny, combined with diminished necessity, made continued service increasingly fraught. Families of executioners felt the effects as well. Children and apprentices who had been trained for succession often sought other trades, aware that the long-term prospects of the profession were declining. Households transitioned toward more conventional livelihoods, gradually abandoning the tools, rituals, and social isolation that had defined their lives for generations. Interestingly, the slow disappearance of executioners reflected broader historical patterns. Professional specialization that once seemed essential became obsolete as society evolved. Skills honed over decades, precise timing, instrument maintenance, and ritual coordination, were replaced by legal reforms, institutional oversight, and technological innovation. Executioners were not replaced in a single act, they simply became fewer, their work less visible, and their households reintegrated into ordinary civic life. And yet, the memory of the profession persisted in social consciousness. Stories, rumors, and records preserved the image of men and women who walked the margins of society, carrying both authority and stigma. The disappearance was gradual, but the cultural imprint, the knowledge of precise skill, moral tension, and social isolation, remained in collective memory. Even after executioners disappeared from towns and villages, their imprint lingered in law, ritual, and social memory. Legal codes retained terminology, procedures, and penalties shaped by centuries of practice, long after the men and women wielding rope and axe had vanished. Laws still prescribed death, fines, or corporal punishment, but the administration of these punishments shifted to institutional authorities, prisons, or state-appointed officers. Statutes often referred explicitly to methods once under the executioner's control: hanging, beheading, or burning. Ropes, scaffolds, and blocks remained in the text, even as their use became rare. The law, in essence, preserved the memory of their role, codifying the profession's authority long after practitioners had faded into obscurity. Executioners, once indispensable, became a historical reference embedded in legislation. Courts continued rituals derived from executioner practices. Witnesses, clerics, and magistrates followed procedures shaped by centuries of public execution. Records, scrolls, and manuals reference timing, precision, and the sequence of punishment, formalizing knowledge once held exclusively by the executioner. These traces in law served as reminders of both the necessity and the human labor once required to enforce justice. Cultural memory, however, carried a more vivid legacy. Folk tales, gossip, and moral stories preserved images of executioners as both feared and marginalized figures. In some regions, they became characters of cautionary narrative, symbols of justice, moral tension, or social otherness. People remembered not only their skill but also the stigma, isolation, and moral complexity that accompanied the profession. Executioners were ghosts in memory, their lives shaping imagination long after their tools were set aside. Even physical spaces reflected memory. Blocks, scaffolds, and gallows, once functional, became markers of history. Some were dismantled, others preserved as relics or curiosities. Towns maintained these sites as reminders of law, order, and mortality. Executioners' presence was tangible in the environment, a silent testimony to labor that had been both necessary and socially fraught. Family histories carried echoes of the profession. Descendants of executioners retained stories, objects, or oral traditions that conveyed the technical expertise, moral tension, and social isolation experienced by ancestors. Tools, coins, or clothing became artifacts of a vanished life, bridging centuries and reminding later generations of the complexity of human survival in marginal roles. Psychologically, societies adapted to the absence of executioners. Law enforcement became increasingly institutionalized, punishment more regulated, and public ritual less frequent. Yet the cultural imagination preserved the moral and social dimensions of their work. Executioners represented a liminal space where law, morality, and human psychology intersected, a cautionary reminder that justice, while necessary, is inseparable from the labor, skill, and burden of those who enforce it. Even language retained traces. Terms like hangman, headsman, or executioner survived as metaphors, idioms, or moral references. The profession's vocabulary, technical and symbolic, entered cultural consciousness, shaping literature, theater, and social commentary. In this way, executioners remained present, even as their role became obsolete. Yet the persistence of memory raised questions. What does society remember? The skill, the moral tension, or the fear they inspired? Is memory shaped by admiration, horror, or curiosity? And how much of the executioner's lived experience, the quiet discipline, the meticulous care, the daily negotiation of moral and social weight, is preserved in law and cultural imagination? In the end, executioners vanished from towns, statutes, and streets, yet they remained in the quiet spaces of legal codes, cultural memory, and historical reflection. Their labor, marginalized and morally complex, continued to shape society in subtle ways long after the tools were set aside.